This is a continuation of the series on the Jewish Gentile controversy, centered in Acts 15. We were looking at the passage where a sect, the believing sect of the Pharisees, stood up and said to the first church council, says, you must circumcise the Gentiles who are coming to Christ. You must command them to keep the law of Moses. And so we've looked at this from various angles. Today I want to talk about the law and zero in on some passages on the law. And I kind of hesitated to do this, frankly, because it's complex. It's something that commentators and Christian thinkers have struggled with through the generations over and over and over. Is Paul, what do you mean, Paul? What does this mean? What are you trying to tell us? And I'm not saying that commentators haven't got it right sometimes, but we've sure spent a lot of words talking about it and agonizing over it, thinking about it, and trying to explain it to people, trying to explain it to ourselves. I mean, it's what Peter says. Peter says, there's some things that the beloved brother Paul has written that are difficult to understand, he says, and the ignorant and the undisciplined distort it like they do the rest of the scriptures to their own destruction. There are some things hard to understand that Paul says. So why would I even try to explain this? And well, I don't know what to tell you except that my son's asked me, and I think there's something there that will benefit everybody in looking at it. So here we go. We're going to talk about law. I'm going to first point out that the scriptures are very clear that the law is good, right, spiritual. There's really nothing wrong with the law itself per se. Let's look at, I want to just start off with Deuteronomy 4, 5 through 8. Deuteronomy 4, 5 through 8. All right, here we go. Deuteronomy 4, 5 through 8. See, this is Moses talking to the children of Israel in the wilderness. See, I have taught you decrees and laws, as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you're entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, Gentiles, who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them, the way the Lord our God is near to us when we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I'm setting before you today? Wow. I think this is really important to understand. There's a whole body of laws. In fact, in the Middle Ages sometime, some great Jewish rabbi counted 613 that were in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Now, you might count yourself and come up with 1,000 maybe. The thing is, he had to eliminate duplicates, redundancies, and there was judgment calls on which ones were really unique and which ones were just nuance of another command. But that 613 has become fairly popular among Jews to this day. They talk about the 613 commands of the Torah. And if you analyze them, if you look at them, they cover every fabric of life. There's laws pertaining to justice, capital punishment. There's laws pertaining to food. There's laws pertaining to clothing. There's laws pertaining to hygiene. There's laws that pertain to nursing. What's communicative diseases. There's laws pertaining to war. There's laws pertaining to agriculture. There's laws pertaining to marriage. There's laws pertaining to children. There's laws pertaining to slavery. There's laws pertaining to the temple. Consecration to God of support of the temple. There's laws pertaining to sacrifices. There's laws pertaining to kings and how a town and a city and the nation would be governed in terms of disputes. There's laws, anyway, there's laws that touch every area of life. Why is that? Because, when we think about the commands of Christ, they certainly don't cover all those things. The things that Jesus told us to do in the Gospels and the things that the apostles zeroed in on that's self-evident to us from their letters, for example, don't cover all these areas by any means. So why did the law cover all of this? Well, what you need to understand is that God pulled a nation of people out of a nation. They had been slaves for 400 years. They lived in a great nation, the greatest nation in all the world. If there was any nation that had laws, it certainly was Egypt. If there was any nation that had all the trappings of a sophisticated culture, it was Egypt. That was the center. And they were going into a land where there was many nations that had laws, but God wanted them to be different, and He wanted them to be ruled and to operate in a different way. And so He gave them these laws that covered every functional area of life, because otherwise they wouldn't have laws. They would come up with their own. They would come up with some that they knew in Egypt. They would come up with some that in the land they were going. But every society, every culture, every nation has to have laws. We have to have laws. We cannot exist without some laws. And the more there are of us, and the more different we are from each other, well, the more different our situations, the more laws there have to be. Laws, as I think I said last time, is like it enables us to live together in peace and harmony. Otherwise, society degenerates. So a lawless person is not what you want to be. A godly person is really a law abider, one who values and cherishes law, because ultimately, as we understand from the scriptures, law is about loving your neighbor. Law is about peace and harmony and goodwill and really attaining some measure of the paradise that we lost. So then, what you have to understand is that these laws cover every area in the Pentateuch. And it's not an encyclopedia. 613 in the grand scheme of things is a pretty small number. You say, well, that's a whole lot. No, not really. Because how many laws are there in our land? You couldn't count the number of laws that you're subject to, that you're under, that you operate by. Now, some things we might not call laws. I don't know if I mentioned this last time or not. I can't remember. That's all kind of blurry together. But when you brush your teeth, in a sense, that's a law. You have a custom. You have a rule. You could call it a law to brush your teeth before you go to bed. There's things that you do. Stopping at the stop sign, obviously a law. Certainly punishable by government if you don't. But there's many, many, many varied laws. We have laws just like they had laws. We have laws up the yin-yang. We have more laws than they do, no doubt. And we as human beings are used to it. We adjust. We that's part of growing up, is becoming accustomed to laws, becoming accustomed to authority in all the different dimensions of life. Every law has its own jurisdiction, its own place, and is enforced by some thing or body in that society. So law, we're never lawless. At least we better not be. The Antichrist is the one who's the only one that's called the lawless one. We don't want to be lawless. In fact, we want to be obedient in every respect to law. The good laws, anyway, that are by those authorized to exercise authority in the various jurisdictions of life. And this is consistent with Christian teaching, Jewish teaching. It's just the way it is. But the Jews, this was before their dispersion, had their own land. They were separate. They were called out. They were appointed. And so they could keep the laws that they had. And like I say, the laws, it was not an encyclopedia. If, like for example, there was laws that pertained to a poor man, you couldn't say you were being mischievous, and I can see some teenagers trying to do this, putting a stumbling block in a blind person's way. That it was specifically called out in the law not to do. Well, frankly, there's many ways you can be mischievous to the handicapped. That's only one. So the law just touches on certain things. It's not a comprehensive, and if it was comprehensive, it would be a huge, huge encyclopedia. Maybe it'd fill the world, I don't know. Another example, in the law, the roofs were not, they were flat, or relatively flat. So people could live, they could do double duty and be on the roof. And you see examples of that in Scripture. But the thing about it is you had to build a fence around it so people wouldn't fall off and get hurt. That was in the law. So this was a law for safety. For the love of your neighborhood, you had to think about your neighbor's safety. Of course, it could be your own kids for that matter. But you also had other people up there. So there are many different aspects of caring for your neighbor that the law didn't include about safety. You weren't supposed to put two types of animals together and make them plow together. Why would that be? Because it would be an unnecessary burden on one. It would be hard for them unless they were, quote, equally yoked. Wouldn't be good for either one. It would just be kind of, why? God cares about animals. Are there other ways that you can be somewhat cruel to animals? Well, absolutely. I mean, it says like you can you can take the contents of a nest and the eggs and eat them. But you can't take the contents of the nest and use it as a lure to get the mom and then capture the mom too. I mean, there are many examples of this kind of law giving that it's not comprehensive. It's samplings. It's like the law is a portal in the ancient world to God's heart. How he felt about and thought about us as human beings and our relationships to each other and to the world, to animals, even to the land. There were things that he told us to do. One of the things that's so contrary to the way the ancients used to think, so unique, I believe, and I'm not a historian, so maybe there was other examples in the ancient world, but I don't know of any. The law was the basis for life. And even a king, the ruler of the nation, was subject to the law. In most cultures through time, the king, or whoever's in charge, considers himself over the law, not under the law. But in Jewish society, it was very clear. And king, there was also a boundaries, as it were. The king had a arena that he could operate in terms of ruling. His rulership was not unlimited. For example, he couldn't just go into the temple. He wasn't the one that paid for all of the temple. He wasn't the one that was in control of the priests. He had his place in society, but it was under law, and it was separate from, well, the priesthood and the temple, and that arena was given to the priests. This kind of thinking has impressed the Gentiles, the nations of the world, throughout time. As a matter of fact, the founders of our country, many of them were profoundly impressed by Israel. Now, why do I know that? Well, I've read in many of the universities starting up in this country, Hebrew was the preferred language of choice to learn of the scriptural languages, not Greek. There was a lot of study and discussion and debate around government because we as a nation had to come into our own government. We were breaking free from the monarchy that we had always known through the generations, and we were coming into something that we called a republic. And a lot of those discussions and that debate had to do with how God had ordained the Jewish nation to be set up and to rule. And, another example is how they took care of the poor. Property rights redistribution in the year of Jubilee. Leaving the edge of your harvest, the perimeters, for the poor and the orphan to eat from. Taxation, setting aside a certain portion of your goods for not only the support of the temple and the priests, but also for the poor. There was many such things. It was a good law. It was a righteous law. And it touched every area of life. But as I say, it wasn't comprehensive. It was like a sampling. Not only that, but it assumed certain things. It assumed that the people would be in the land of their own, that they would be independent. Now Moses prophesied that you're not going to be. He prophesied they wouldn't keep the law. They wouldn't be able to keep it. He prophesied that they'd be taken into captivity. He prophesied all that. But nonetheless, the law was framed as if the children of Israel would be in the land of Palestine and that they would be independent. So we know, of course, through history that there got to be a time when they weren't at all. They were carried into captivity, and even when they returned from captivity, there was very little time that they were totally independent. They had to answer to some nation of some sort. And of course, even in Jesus' time, they had to get permission to crucify him because they weren't entitled to have the death penalty, even though the death penalty was spelled out in their law. That's just one example among many. So the law is a window into the heart of God. Psalms 119 is oftentimes referred to by us as Christians, and it is so delightful. I mean, if you read it, you say, oh my goodness. 119, say verse 97, I'm just sampling here, but it goes on and on and on about the law. Verse 97, oh, how I love your law. I meditate on it all day long. Your commands make me wiser than my enemies, for they are ever with me. I have more insight than all my teachers, for I meditate on your statutes. I have more understanding than the elders, for I obey your precepts. You can read it over and over and over in various ways because Psalms 119 just keeps repeating in a different language all the benefits of being of this law, the law that was given to Moses. And it's a fantastic law. because, like I said, you can see God's heart. You can see God's heart in it. You can see it's not comprehensive, and it is not always relevant. I just gave one case, when they lost their rights to rule over themselves, foreign governments, when they were dispersed through the nations and didn't have access to their original land. There were several things that just the laws that didn't pertain anymore. So it wasn't always relevant to them, and it wasn't comprehensive. And in some ways, Jesus makes clear that the law is minimalist. And what do I mean by that? In Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, I'm thinking of particularly, Jesus has this talk where he's laying out his teachings, his commandments. And he's speaking to Jews. This is Jews now, just Jews. And he says, you've heard it said that. For example, he talks about you shouldn't commit adultery. But I say to you, and he's talking about, he is talking with an air that the scribes, the Pharisees, the Jews of the day did not talk in. It was very evident to everybody that was listening. There's only one man that can say, but I say, and set aside, as it were, kind of shoved to the side. You've heard it said. Well, by whom? Well, the teaching authorities, the Pharisees, the scribes, tradition, even the law itself. He's quoting from it. He pushes it aside. But I say to you, the only one in Jewish expectation that would do that, or could even do that, was the Messiah himself. So he has several of these. You've heard it said, you shall kill. And I say, even if you're angry, and on he goes. In other words, what he's saying is the law, in many cases, is a minimal. It's kind of like a surface kind of thing. There's deeper, it's a portal into God's heart. But if you really see and know and understand the ways of God, you'll see the deeper implications. And they may not be called out, but they're there. God says about divorce. Yeah, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. And really what he was doing, and this is Mark's interpretation, and another's interpretation too, but he was keeping men of that day and time from playing with their wives by threatening to divorce them, and then divorcing them, and then taking them back, throwing them out, taking them back, because a woman was so precarious in the society of that day, men's society. Weren't like they have now. They didn't have food stamps or whatever resources, and they were often out exposed, as it were, in a man's society. And so men would play with their wives if they got mad at them. Moses says, you can't do that. If you're going to get rid of your wife, you've got to give her a piece of paper. And then once you've given that to her, you can't take her back. In other words, it's permanent. So what was that for? Well, it was mercy, it was compassion. It was a way in which the law was saying, treat your wives right in the first place. They're not just property. And anyway, we could go on and on talking about all these various things of how that the law is good and it's a portal. But you know what? It demanded interpretation. Why do I say that? Well, at one point in time, let's see if I can grab hold of this. Jesus said something like, yes, this is Matthew 23. Matthew 23, he said said this: because the law wasn't comprehensive, and because the situation of Jews changed, they didn't always live in the land, and now with the dispersion, there was Jews all over the place. This is Matthew 23, verse 1-4. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat or chair. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you. But don't do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. What? They put heavy loads and we're to obey them in everything? What was the role of Moses' seat? Well, the way it was understood in the ancient world, in the Jewish world, was that Moses had delegated his authority, and it was God-given authority, and the delegation was God-given authority. These people had the authority to make judgments about the law, how it was to be applied, and they, as it were, put a fence around everything. They filled in the blanks, as it were. They made the law more comprehensive. They interpreted the law in different situations that maybe didn't exist in Moses' day. They had authority to do that. Jesus acknowledged that authority and said that the Jews of his time needed to keep it. They needed to obey that. But he acknowledged that it was a heavy burden. So the law required an interpretive body. You know, one time, when Jesus' apostles were preaching later on, the Pharisees got together and they said, this mob, this people is cursed because they don't even know the law. And frankly, that's true. The Jewish people, even in the best of times, have been largely ignorant of the law. But if you think about it, to be familiar with the implications of 613 commands that aren't even comprehensive, that cover every arena of life, is not like just having memorized the 10 Commandments. And if you look at the volumes over the generations of Jewish literature, of books, volumes of books that have been written, commentary on it and how to apply it and all the different issues and debates, you realize that being a Jew is not necessarily easy. Not necessarily easy. And it wasn't in Jesus' time. And, well, it's still hard today. Now, part of the reason for difficulty in interpretation is because the situation of Jews today is so very different from the situation in Moses' time. And one is they don't have their own land, and that came up fairly soon. Well, that came about 400 years before Christ. Remember, they were in Babylonian. That was their first initiation into not really having their own land. And then when they came back, in Jesus' time, it was occupied by Romans. They were dominated by Romans, so there was things they could not keep. But then something horrible happened. Something that changed the fabric of Jewishness in a mind-boggling way. It was really a paradigm shift. For Jews, it was something that they struggled to get under their belt, to grasp, to even know what to do. They lost the temple. And in effect then, they lost the priesthood, they lost the whole sacrificial system. This was in 70 A.D. So it was after the church began, after Jesus Christ had been risen crucified, after the church's first few decades of existence. But that's a lot of the law. That's a lot of the law. So, Today, when Jews talk about the 613, what they acknowledge is that over half of those they're unable to keep because they're either not in their own land or because the temple doesn't exist anymore or other reasons as well. So, you gotta, to be a good Jew, and you're going to be conscientious about these things, and you've got traditions now that are binding on you, that aren't even explicitly in the Torah. I'm trying to paint you a picture that being a Jew in some ways is a blessed thing, but in other ways it's tough. Why am I saying this? Because we've already come across language in our study of Acts 15 where the apostles, Peter, that it's a burden. What? Yeah. Next. Yeah, we read it. We did read it. Maybe you glossed over it. Acts 15. Let me just kind of underscore it again. He says, why do you test God? This is Peter speaking. Chapter 15, verse 10 of Acts. Why do you test God by putting on the necks of the disciples a yoke that neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear? Oh my goodness, Peter, don't you keep the law? Yeah, but it's not easy. It's not easy. It's not easy being a Jew. It's not easy keeping the law, the Mosaic law. It's not easy. And it goes on in different places where we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles returning to God, James says. And later on when they wrote the letter, it says, it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us not to burden you with anything beyond these brief requirements. And there's other places in Scripture where it talks about this yoke, this burden. And you say, well, how do you reconcile that? Because Christ says, and this is Christ, he says in, where does he say it? He says it in Matthew too. He says, this is chapter 11, verse 28, and you remember it. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. Well, here he got his apostles as Jews saying that the burden's heavy. The yoke is something we can't bear. What's going on here? Yeah, or in 1 John 5. Let's read that one. Now I realize that this is quite a bit later. This is one of the last books in the Bible written, probably. 1 John 5, verses 1 through 5. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commandments. This is the love of God, to obey his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. For everyone born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that overcomes the world, even our faith. Who is he that overcomes the world? Only he that believes that Jesus is the Son of God. I'm not going to interpret that for you. I'd love to. That would be another brief teaching. I believe there's a way of understanding that. But the thing about it is, his commandments are not burdensome. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? We'll talk more about this next time. Maybe we'll take a different tact on it, approach it. We'll look at some other scriptures, but we'll have another series on specifically what we call the law and all that is in Scripture about. Till next time.